Next, we're going to have Tatsuro Ide from Japan, who's going to talk to us a bit about reconsidering the passivity of Miller's narrator, in specifically The Rosy Crucifixion, which I'm always very happy to hear more people talk about the crucifixion.
I'm Tatsuro Ide from Japan. I am truly honored to be part of this memorable event. My first encounter with Henry Miller came through Steve Erickson, a contemporary American writer from LA. I began my academic career by studying contemporary American literature, and at that time, Steve Erickson was quite popular in Japan. In an interview with a Japanese translator, Erickson mentioned that he had been greatly influenced by two writers. One is William Faulkner, and two, Henry Miller. I was impressed by Erickson's remark that he learned from Miller's work the importance of getting naked as an artist. That was the starting point that guided me to Miller's work. To be honest, Miller's novels were so difficult for me, especially because I couldn't find any consistent theme in his fragmentary style. And Erickson's remark, the importance of getting naked, also slipped my mind. It took me years to find something in Miller's work worth exploring in my own way. But in hindsight, I realized that what I eventually found is not so far from what Erickson said. That is the question of passivity, which I would like to discuss in this presentation. So this presentation explores the passivity of the narrator I as a possibility of responsibility to others in Henry Miller's The Rosy Crucifixion trilogy, Sexus, Plexus, and Nexus, through the lens of New Modernist Studies, a 21st century rethinking of modernism. George Orwell once criticized the narrator of Cancer as an utterly passive figure, detached from the world, which is quite consistent with the traditional modernist subject as an isolated individual. Yet Miller did not abandon this passive stance. He radicalized it in The Rosy Crucifixion. Set in Miller's early life before he became a writer, the trilogy transforms passivity into exposure to others, undermining the notion of the self-enclosed subject. In contrast to Orwell's critique, the narrator's passivity becomes the very source of his engagement with the people he encounters, resonating with American philosopher Judith Butler's idea of responsibility as an ethical relation to others. Section 1, New Modernist Studies, the modernist subject and the question of community. New Modernist Studies is a recent critical movement that calls traditional modernist scholarship into question. Gerard Rodriguez Salas, Paula Martin Salvan, and Maria J. Lopez give a clear account of what is at stake in this new perspective. According to them, traditional modernist studies have sought to understand modernism by focusing on the solitary individual. Influential critics such as Georg Lukács helped to establish this image of the modernist subject. As they quote, for Lukács, in modernist literature, man is by nature solitary, asocial, unable to enter into relationship with other human beings. What New Modernist Studies explore is an alternative possibility to this traditional view of the modernist subject. Salas, Salvan, and Lopez acknowledge that modernist writers certainly address the question of individuality, commonly recognizing the condition of solitude and isolation. However, they argue that it is precisely through these conditions that modernist writers also confront the question of community. Quote 1. We hope to demonstrate that in the modernist self's quest of interiority, there is also a search for alternative collective bonds. This presentation, then, reads Henry Miller's work in light of this approach in New Modernist Studies, interpreting his lifelong focus on the first-person singular in his autobiographical novels as an ethical engagement with others. Section 2, Orwell's critique of Miller's passivity. This view of the modernist subject can be clearly seen in George Orwell's critique of Henry Miller's early works. It can be said that Miller's writings have a clear tendency that makes them a typical example of the modernist subject, as defined by traditional modernist studies. They are always narrated by a first-person narrator, the I, which strongly reflects Miller's own experiences. This first-person narrator as modernist subject is highlighted in George Orwell's harsh criticism of Miller's early novels, particularly regarding the narrator's passive attitude. In his famous essay, Inside the Whale, while Orwell praises Miller for vividly capturing the atmosphere of the post-World War I period, he also expresses a negative view of the narrator's passivity. Orwell likens Miller's stance to Jonah inside a transparent whale. Quote 2. Only he feels no impulse to alter or control the process that he is undergoing. He has performed the essential Jonah act of allowing himself to be swallowed, remaining passive, accepting. Orwell concludes that Miller's significance is limited to his very early work up to Tropic of Cancer, since this passive attitude would prevent his work from further development. Section 3, Passivity as Passion in Sexus. However, rather than overcoming this passivity, Miller deepens it in his later works, especially in the Rosy Crucifixion trilogy. The trilogy is also autobiographical, depicting his experiences in 1920s New York, just before he leaves for Paris. While going through divorce proceedings with his first wife, Maud, he becomes captivated by a dancer named Mona, to the extent that he wishes to marry her. At the same time, he aspires to become a writer. Although Mona and his friends recognize his talent as a writer, he struggles to complete any literary work. During these difficult days, the narrator eventually marries Mona, but she develops a close relationship with her female partner, Stacia. His ambition to become a writer remains unrealized. The title of the trilogy, The Rosy Crucifixion, emphasizes this passivity as it refers to the passion of Jesus Christ, a parallel that the narrator in Sexus immediately draws for himself. Quote 3, I was approaching my 33rd year, the age of Christ crucified. This passivity of the narrator is vividly articulated in the opening scene through Mona's repeated encouragement. Why don't you try to write? As the narrator's first marriage comes to an end, he deepens his relationship with Mona, who recognizes his talent as a writer and urges him to write. Quote 4, the book was wonderful. She had only begun it this morning. Why didn't I try to write? She was sure I could write a great book. Her encouragement continues to haunt the narrator. Quote 5, the little phrase, why don't you try to write, involves me, as it had from the very beginning, in a hopeless bog of confusion. Since the narrator does not achieve his position as a writer during the entire trilogy, the phrase, "Why don't you try to write?" ultimately underscores the fact that he cannot become a writer in the active, autonomous sense. What is significant in this context of this presentation is that the narrator's passivity cannot be reduced to his incapacity to become a writer. Rather, it is redefined through his introduction of the word passion. The narrator uses the term passion while deeply contemplating what it means to be a writer. He states, quote 6, "The only time a writer receives his due reward is when someone comes to him, burning with this flame, which he found in a moment of solitude. Honest criticism means nothing. What one wants is unrestrained passion, fire for life." For him, the definition of a writer is not someone who actively engages in the act of writing, but rather someone to whom others are drawn. Although this may seem a strange idea at first, he is right to associate it with the word passion in its etymological sense. Typically, passion seems to evoke the image of strong willpower and active desire. However, just as the adjective passive means, to quote the Oxford English Dictionary, is acted upon or is capable of being acted upon from outside. Passion is primarily characterized by its passivity, by something one cannot fully control. The narrator thus articulates this passive aspect of passion by linking it to the image of the writer to whom someone comes. Actually, it is this passion as passivity as paradoxically generates Miller's narrative. Certainly, the Rosy Crucifixion contains a loose central plot revolving around the narrator's complicated relationship with Mona, which becomes entangled in a triangular relationship with Stacia. However, as in many of Miller's other works, the narrative as a whole is composed of miscellaneous episodes that the narrator encounters by accident. Although he is an aspiring writer, he cannot stay focused on his work at his desk and immediately goes out into the streets. The lack of a clear purpose inevitably leads him to unpredictable events, which in turn constitute the narrative itself. One of his friends, Ulrich, articulated this secret of Miller's narrative. Quote 7, "Your whole life seems to be made up of just such incidents. Now, why is that? Can you tell me? Don't laugh at me. I know it sounds foolish to ask such a question. I know, too, that I'm a rather cagey bird. You seem to lay yourself wide open. I suppose that's the secret of it." As Ulrich compares himself to a cagey bird, the narrator's openness stands in sharp contrast to the image of Jonah enclosed inside the whale, described by Orwell. Rather than being closed off, Miller's passivity is radically open, which constantly leads him to the accidental incidents that make up his narrative. Section 4, Exposure to Others and Responsibility in Plexus. Plexus, the second novel of the trilogy, develops this idea further by transforming such openness into a form of response to others. The novel begins with the narrative's new married life with Mona and ends with the emergence of Stacia, Mona's female partner. Within this complicated triangle relationship among Miller, Mona, and Stacia, the meaning of the title Plexus seems to be quite apparent. It symbolizes an intricate network of relations. However, what is truly intricate in the context of this presentation is that the narrator frequently digresses from this main plot of his personal life, recounting numerous episodes involving seemingly irrelevant people whom he encounters only by chance. In Plexus, he articulates this passive attitude through a grammatical confusion between subject and object. While he remains the first-person narrator, he describes the joy of being placed in the position of the object. Quote 8. I can't say that I walk down this street, nor can I say either that I glide through it. The street invests me. I am devoured by it. Perhaps only in the insect world are there sensations to match this harrowing form of bliss. To eat is wonderful, but to be eaten is a treat beyond description. Perhaps it is another, more extravagant kind of union with the external world, an inverted sort of communion. This joy of passivity makes the autobiographical novel literally a plexus, since it no longer privileges the narrator's personal affairs, but opens itself to intricate encounters with others. In fact, the narrator makes it clear at the end that his purpose in writing is not only describe his own life, but also to engage with the lives of others. He states, quote 9, once I thought that I had been wounded as no man ever had. Because I felt thus, I vowed to write this book. But long before I began the book, the wound had healed. Since I had sworn to fulfill my task, I reopened the horrible wound. Let me put it another way. Perhaps in opening the wound, my own wound, I closed other wounds, other people's wounds. Through the physical image of wounds, his passivity is now more deeply associated with the condition of being open. What Plexus presents, then, is a radical confusion of the narrator and other people. What is especially suggestive is that this emphasis on opening resonates strongly with Judith Butler's account of ethical relation to others in her discussion of responsibility. In her book, Giving an Account of Oneself, Butler takes up the question of whether one can ever truly give an account of oneself, drawing attention to the simple fact that one must address another in order to do so. She links this relational thing to the very notion of responsibility. Quote from the middle part. Furthermore, the scene of address, what we might call the rhetorical condition for responsibility, means that while I am engaging in a reflective activity, thinking about and reconstructing myself, I'm also speaking to you and thus elaborating a relation to another in language as I go. For Butler, responsibility does not arise from one's deliberate actions, but from a prior exposure and susceptibility to the other. On the contrary, I am not primarily responsible by virtue of my actions, but by virtue of the relation to the other that is established at the level of my primary and reversible susceptibility, my passivity prior to any possibility of action or choice. The narrator's act of reopening his wound in Plexus thus literally embodies this meaning of responsibility, insofar as it arises from radical passivity as an openness that exposes him to the wounds of others. Section 5, Passivity of the I as responsibility to others in Nexus. Nexus, the final work of the trilogy, further demonstrates passivity of the I as a responsibility to others. On the one hand, the main plot continues to trace the narrator's complicated relationship with Mona and Stacia throughout the narrative. On the other hand, his long struggle to become a writer leads him to recognize the question of the I within his own narrative. Quote, yes, in my stumbling, bumbling way, I was making all manner of discoveries. One of them was that one cannot hide his identity under cover of the third person, nor establish his identity solely through the use of the first person singular. This passage shows that what his autobiographical novels give an account of can never be reduced to his own life alone. For the narrator, writing in the first person singular is inseparable from his ethical engagement with others. This recognition of the first person narrator is not a static mixture of the first and third persons. In Nexus, the narrator articulates his act of writing as a form of responsibility in Butler's sense. He confesses that when he writes well, his words are addressed to each other, to each of his friends. Quote, once I got under wing, once I hit my stride, it was like eating peanuts. One thought induced another. And as my finger flew, pleasant but utterly extraneous ideas would intrude, without damaging the flow, such as this passage for you, Alric. I can hear you chuckling in advance, or how Omara will gobble this up. This direct address to his friends cannot be understood simply as an expression of personal friendship. Throughout the entire trilogy, while the narrator appears to center his own life as the main motive, what he actually writes is filled with encounters that arise through his passive attitude. In this sense, the narrator's I is not autonomous agency that gives an account of itself. Rather, his direct address to his friends reveals his recognition of writing as a responsibility that emerges through passivity. What is significant in the context of this presentation is that the trilogy ends with the narrator's quotation of the title of George Orwell's novel. Quote, keep the aspidistra flying. Orwell's novel of the title centers on a man who abandons his career as a poet amid his struggle with poverty. In contrast, Miller's trilogy concludes just before the narrator leaves for Paris, suggesting that his journey toward becoming a writer is still ongoing. The narrator's use of the exclamation mark after the quotation may seem to highlight this contrast between the two works. However, whether the usage is ironic or not, the narrator ultimately includes in his own narrative the words of Orwell, who had once criticized his passivity. Contrary to the image of Jonah inside the wheel, the ending of the trilogy demonstrates that Miller's passivity remains radically open as a responsibility to others. Thank you for listening.